17 of Atlanta's most powerful families nearly destroyed themselves in the summer of 1850. Not because of war, not because of money, not because of disease, but because of one enslaved man whose only crime was being seen. For 8 months, the most respectable homes in the city became battlegrounds of jealousy, obsession, and quiet madness. Engagements collapsed, marriages fractured, women were institutionalized. A mob nearly lynched a man who had never broken a single law. And at the center of it all stood a young man listed in auction records as nothing more than Property No. 447, male, approximately 23 years of age, house-trained, literate. The official records say nothing else. They do not mention the silence that fell over the auction house when he stepped onto the platform. They do not mention the way four prominent women began bidding against one another with trembling hands. They do not mention that, by the end of the day, Atlanta had unknowingly purchased its own unraveling. To understand what happened, you must understand Atlanta in 1850. In 1850, Atlanta was not yet the sprawling metropolis it would become. It was a rising railroad hub, ambitious, raw, determined to prove itself the crown jewel of Georgia commerce. The Western and Atlantic Railroad had transformed a modest settlement into a city, pulsing with cotton wealth and opportunity. Money flowed through counting houses and railway depots. Elegant homes rose along Whitehall Street and Marietta Road. Magnolia trees lined manicured gardens, and beneath all of it lay the unspoken foundation: slavery. The city's elite prided themselves on refinement. Their dinner parties glittered with crystal and silver. Their wives competed over imported china and Parisian gowns. Their daughters were groomed for advantageous marriages. Respectability was everything. And so was control. Nowhere was that competition more subtle or more vicious than among the women of Qualley Hill. They competed over social standing, garden parties, charitable committees, and the elegance of their household staff. It was said that a well-appointed home reflected the moral order of the family within. That belief would soon be tested. The slave market near Decatur Street was crowded that morning. Planters from surrounding counties stood shoulder to shoulder with domestic buyers seeking cooks, seamstresses, drivers, and house servants. The air was thick with humidity and anticipation. Among them stood Constance Hawthorne. Her husband, Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, sat on Georgia's Superior Court. They owned 3 cotton plantations outside the city. Their home was considered one of Atlanta's most elegant. Constance rarely attended auctions herself. Such matters were typically handled by overseers. But rumors had circulated for weeks. A young man from a failed Savannah estate, unusually educated, exceptionally comely. Curiosity had drawn her there. When Property No. 447 was led onto the platform, conversation stopped. Even the auctioneer, Horace Fritcha, a man hardened by years of transactions, hesitated. The young man stood straight, despite the irons on his wrists. His skin held a warm golden undertone, suggesting mixed ancestry. His cheekbones were sharply defined. His eyes, light brown, almost amber in the morning light, scanned the crowd without defiance, without submission. Shimpri o buza banto. He did not plead. He did not bow. He stood as though he were witnessing the room rather than being judged by it. House literate, Fletcher announced, recovering himself. Served 3 years at the Beaumont estate. No record of rebellion. Starting bid, $800. The first bid came immediately. Then another. Then another. The price climbed with startling speed. Constance realized, with a strange tightening in her chest, that she was competing with 3 other women. Not men, but women, each dressed in silk, each maintaining a rigid expression of polite composure. One of them was Rebecca, her closest social rival. 1,200, 1,500, 1,800. At $2,000, murmurs rippled through the crowd. That was an extraordinary price for a male house servant. Rebecca's husband placed a hand on her arm. She shook him off. 2,300. Constance felt heat rising in her face. She did not understand why she continued. Pride. Competition. Something more difficult to name. 2,400. Rebecca hesitated. Her husband leaned in and whispered sharply. Silence stretched. Sold, Fletcher declared, bringing down the gavel. To Mrs. Hawthorne. The room exhaled. Rebecca's smile was tight when she approached. You've made quite an investment, she said lightly. I do hope he proves worth the expense. I'm certain he will, Constance replied. But even as she spoke, she felt unsettled, as if she had purchased not a servant, but something unpredictable, something alive, in a way the room did not know how to contain. Judge Hawthorne barely glanced at the young man when he arrived that afternoon. If he performs well, that is all that matters, the judge said, returning to his study. The household staff reacted differently. Martha, the head cook, crossed herself at the sight of him. That one's trouble, she muttered. Beautiful things always are. The young man's name, according to estate records, was Gabriel. For the first weeks, he worked quietly. He served a dinner with steady hands. He moved through rooms without drawing attention. He spoke only when addressed. Judge Hawthorne praised his composure. Constance congratulated herself on her discernment. Margaret Hawthorne, 20 years old, newly engaged to Robert Cunningham, found herself requesting his presence more often than necessary. No one spoke of it. But something had shifted. Visitors began calling more frequently. Tea invitations multiplied. Rebecca Sutherland appeared unannounced twice in 1 week. And each time, her eyes lingered too long. By the end of May, the Hawthorne home had become the most visited residence in Atlanta. Not because of politics, not because of wealth, but because somewhere in its halls walked a young man who seemed to unsettle the rules of a city built entirely on keeping them intact. Atlanta, though it did not yet realize it, had begun to fracture. By June, Atlanta had begun to orbit him. No one said his name openly in drawing rooms. That would have been improper. Instead, they spoke in suggestion. Your new servant is remarkably well-trained. Constance, I hear he came from Savannah. They say he reads. It was always said lightly, always framed as curiosity. But curiosity does not make women visit the same house 3 times in a week. Rebecca Sutherland returned first. She arrived with a basket of preserves, and a smile stretched too thin across her face. She insisted she needed advice about a charity luncheon. She declined refreshments. She remained seated in the parlor far longer than necessary. When Gabriel entered to serve tea, the air shifted. Rebecca's fingers tightened around her porcelain cup. Her breathing changed, barely perceptible. But there. She asked him nothing, yet watched him as if waiting for him to do something extraordinary. He did nothing. He poured. He stepped back. He kept his gaze lowered. The restraint only deepened the tension. After Rebecca left, Constance found herself unsettled. She told herself it was rivalry, competition between households. That was all. But that night, as she prepared for bed, she realized she could recall precisely how the afternoon light had caught in Gabriel's eyes. That realization frightened her. The next week, Caroline Pembroke called. Caroline was a widow of impeccable reputation, charitable, composed, respected. Her grief had aged her gracefully, giving her an air of quiet intelligence. Unlike Rebecca, She did not stare openly. She asked questions. Where did you learn to read? She asked Gabriel gently, as he refilled her cup. At the Beaumont estate, ma'am. And what did you read? Whatever was available. What do you prefer? He hesitated, then answered carefully. History and poetry. Caroline's lips parted slightly, as though something had confirmed a private suspicion. When she left, she asked Constance, with deliberate casualness, whether Gabriel might assist at her upcoming garden gathering. Only temporarily, she added, purely practical. Constance declined. Her refusal surprised even herself. Within days, rumors spread that Caroline had approached Judge Hawthorne privately, offering $3,000 for Gabriel. $3,000. More than double the original price. Judge Hawthorne refused without hesitation, but he began to watch more closely. The calls increased. Women who had rarely crossed Constance's threshold now found reasons to stop by. A missing recipe, a borrowed book, a forgotten glove. They lingered in hallways. They timed their visits near dinner. They asked unnecessary questions. The Hawthorne home, once orderly and predictable, felt charged, like a room before a thunderstorm. Margaret saw it before anyone admitted it. "Mother," she said one morning, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "They are not visiting. You—" Constance stiffened. What an absurd suggestion. "They watch him. All of them, even Mrs. Crane. And she prides herself on moral superiority." Margaret's tone held something else, something brittle beneath the anger. Jealousy. That frightened Constance more than the gossip. "You are imagining things," she said sharply. But that night, at dinner, she observed Elizabeth Crane more carefully. Elizabeth was known for her composure. She rarely displayed emotion in public, yet when Gabriel moved behind her chair, she visibly lost her place in conversation. Her husband asked her a question twice. Before she responded, her hands trembled as she reached for her wine. The other women noticed. And they noticed that the others noticed. Desire, once isolated, becomes contagious. By July, the competition was no longer subtle. At a dinner party hosted by the Hawthornes, 12 guests gathered around the long mahogany table. Silver glinted in candlelight. Laughter rang politely, but eyes followed him. Gabriel moved with quiet efficiency, serving without pause. He did not encourage attention. He did not seek it. His expression remained composed. Elizabeth Crane's breathing grew shallow as the evening progressed. During dessert, she excused herself abruptly. 15 minutes passed. Constance rose, irritation tightening her spine. She found Elizabeth in the hallway near the servants' quarters, standing too close to Gabriel. Her face was flushed, her voice unsteady. "You cannot," she began, then faltered when she saw Constance. The scene was ambiguous enough to deny, but damning enough to humiliate. Elizabeth fled the house in tears. By morning, her husband had demanded explanations. No explanations satisfied him. Whispers spread. Rebecca Sutherland's visits became frantic. She accused Constance of hoarding resources. She offered more money. When Constance refused again, Rebecca's restraint cracked. "You think you're immune," she hissed. "You think you are above it? Above what?" Constance did not answer, because she knew the truth was more disturbing than scandal. It was not that Gabriel was seducing these women. He barely spoke. It was that he existed in contradiction. He was legally property, yet undeniably human. He was expected to be invisible, yet impossible to ignore. He stood inside the rigid hierarchy of Southern society, while quietly defying it, simply by being. That tension created a psychological rupture, and rupture demands resolution. Some sought possession. Others sought destruction. Rebecca's breaking point came in late July. She invited herself to the Hawthorne residence under the pretense of reconciliation. Her manner was overly warm, almost trembling. When Gabriel passed through the parlor alone, she followed. Moments later, a crash echoed. Constance entered to find a shattered vase, and Rebecca holding a shard of porcelain, her arm raised. If he were scarred, Rebecca said breathlessly, it would end. It would all end. Gabriel stood still. He did not move to defend himself. He only looked at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with something like weary understanding. Rebecca dropped the shard and collapsed into sobs. Her husband removed her from the house that evening. Within a week, she was sent to an asylum in Officially, it was exhaustion. Unofficially, everyone knew. Atlanta had begun to unravel. Margaret's engagement dissolved quietly. Robert Cunningham claimed incompatibility. His family cited unsuitable influences. The truth hovered unspoken. Margaret retreated into silence. Judge Hawthorne grew irritable at the constant visitors. He questioned servants. He demanded order. But order had already slipped. One evening, Constance found herself alone in the parlor with Gabriel. The house was quiet. She studied him openly for the first time. Do you understand what is happening? She asked. Yes, ma'am. And what do you think of it? He chose his words carefully. I think people see what they need to see. She felt heat rise to her face. And what do they see? Possibility, he replied softly. Or rebellion, or escape. And what are you? A man, he said, though that seems to matter least. That was the moment Constance understood the true danger. It was not attraction, it was recognition. If he was fully human, then the system was built on a lie. And lies, when exposed, breed panic. By August, the panic turned outward. A merchant attacked Gabriel in the street, accusing him of corrupting his wife. A stable behind the Hawthorne residence burned under suspicious circumstances. Men began speaking in taverns of restoring order. Gabriel became less a person than a symbol. And symbols are easier to destroy than truths. The city that prided itself on civility began sharpening its teeth, and the summer was far from over. By September, Atlanta no longer whispered it accused. The heat had not broken, and neither had the tension. It lingered in the air like humidity, heavy, suffocating, impossible to ignore. What began as fascination had hardened into resentment, and resentment, when shared, becomes something far more dangerous. The first public accusation came from Thomas Crane. He stood outside the courthouse steps, red-faced and trembling, declaring that his household had been poisoned by unnatural influence. He never said Gabriel's name. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. His wife, Elizabeth, had not appeared in public for weeks. Some said she was ill. Others said she refused to leave her room. A few whispered that she wept constantly, ashamed of something she could not confess. None of them asked what had actually happened, because asking would mean confronting the truth that no seduction had occurred, no impropriety had been proven, no crime had been committed. What frightened them was not what Gabriel had done. It was what they had felt. And so the narrative shifted. He was no longer described as refined. He became manipulative. He was no longer intelligent. He became dangerous. They stripped him of dignity with language first. Then they prepared to strip him of safety. Judge Hawthorne sensed the shift before Constance did. At the courthouse, colleagues avoided his eyes. Conversations stopped when he entered. Invitations slowed. Business contracts stalled. One afternoon, a fellow judge pulled him aside. "You must understand," the man said carefully. "This cannot continue." "What cannot?" Hawthorne replied. "The spectacle, the disruption." "There has been no disruption," Hawthorne insisted. The man's silence said otherwise. That evening, Hawthorne returned home visibly strained. "They're suggesting I sell him," he told Constance. "Quietly. Remove the source of tension." Constance's chest tightened. "Do you intend to?" Hawthorne did not answer immediately. "I purchased him lawfully," he said at last. "I will not be dictated to by hysteria." But it was no longer hysteria. It was organization. Flyers began appearing overnight. Crude, anonymous pamphlets warning of moral decay. They spoke of preserving families, of restoring order, of defending tradition. Gabriel's name was not printed, but his shadow stretched across every word. Margaret watched the town transform with growing dread. She saw the way men gathered in clusters, now, speaking in lowered voices. She saw the way women glanced toward the Hawthorne estate with thinly veiled contempt. And she saw something else, something that unsettled her more deeply than gossip. Fear. Not fear of Gabriel. Fear of themselves. One afternoon, as Gabriel repaired a fence near the edge of the property, a group of boys approached. They were no older than 16, sons of respectable families. They jeered. "Thinks he's better than us, walking around like he owns the place." One threw a stone. It struck Gabriel's shoulder. He did not retaliate. He did not even speak. He simply resumed his work. That restraint enraged them further. Violence demands reaction to justify itself. Without it, it looks what it truly is: cruelty. They left, frustrated. But they would not be the last. Caroline Pembroke's involvement marked a turning point. Unlike the others, Caroline did not unravel. She did not deny her fascination. She studied it. One evening, she requested a private meeting with Judge Hawthorne. In his study, beneath shelves lined with legal volumes, she spoke plainly. "You misunderstand the danger," she said. "Enlighten me," Hawthorne replied coolly. "It is not about desire. It is about contradiction. He stands as proof that your laws are fiction. Hoson Stefanetto, you are overreaching." "Am I?" "You built a system that claims superiority, yet one man's presence unsettles it entirely." "What does that say?" "It says nothing. It says everything." Caroline's voice remained calm. "You may sell him. You may exile him. You may silence him. But the idea cannot be undone." "What idea?" "That humanity does not bend to hierarchy." Her words lingered long after she left. Meanwhile, the hostility escalated. A tavern meeting turned into a rally. Speakers framed Gabriel as a threat to stability. They spoke of safeguarding virtue. They invoked God, tradition, and family. None acknowledged the hypocrisy, because hypocrisy is comfortable when shared. By October, an official complaint reached the city council. It accused the Hawthorne household of fostering social disorder. No evidence was attached. Evidence was unnecessary. Perception had replaced fact. Constance began to feel trapped inside her own home. Visitors no longer came. Deliveries were delayed. Even servants from neighboring estates avoided conversation. The house felt isolated, a fortress surrounded by suspicion. One night, a rock shattered a parlor window. Tied to it was a note. "Remove him." Margaret read it aloud, her voice barely steady. Judge Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "This is intimidation. It is warning," Constance whispered. Gabriel remained composed through it all. If he felt fear, he concealed it well. Late one evening, Margaret found him standing alone beneath the oak tree at the edge of the property. "Do you regret coming here?" she asked softly. He considered. "I regret nothing I chose." "You did not choose this." "No," he agreed, "but I choose how I endure it." She studied him in the fading light. They will not stop. No, he said quietly. They won't. And you're not afraid. He looked toward the distant glow of the town. Fear is constant, he admitted. But fear is not the same as surrender. The following week, the first organized march moved through Atlanta's main street. Torches, chants. Not yet violence, but the promise of it. They stopped short of the Hawthorne gates. 4. Now Judge Hawthorne stood at the window, watching. He had believed law would protect order. He was beginning to understand that law bends when enough people demand it. Inside the house, silence pressed against the walls. Outside, anger gathered like storm clouds. Gabriel was no longer merely a man serving dinner. He had become a symbol of something the town could neither control nor tolerate. And symbols, when feared, are rarely allowed to live quietly. By November, Atlanta had decided not. Officially not, with ink and seal. But in taverns, in pews, in private parlors behind closed doors, the verdict had formed. The Hawthorne estate stood like an island now, surrounded by a current that had turned hostile. Deliveries stopped entirely. Workers refused contracts. Even long loyal acquaintances crossed the street rather than nod in greeting. Judge Hawthorne still walked upright through town, but his authority had thinned. Respect, once automatic, now felt conditional. And beneath it all, the fear was no longer disguised as morality. It was anger. The rally that began as murmurs became organized assemblies. Men gathered weekly beneath the banner of preservation. They spoke of restoring order, of protecting their wives, of defending tradition from corruption. No one asked why their wives needed protection from a man who had never spoken to them, beyond courtesy. The logic was fragile. But fragile logic reinforced by shared panic becomes unbreakable. One Sunday, after church, a crowd formed outside the Hawthorne gates. Not hundreds, dozens. That was enough. They did not carry weapons openly. They carried conviction, and conviction is more. COMBUSTIBLE. Judge Hawthorne stepped onto the porch, jaw set. "What do you want?" he demanded. A man stepped forward, Samuel Briggs, a merchant whose business had recently failed. "We want stability restored," Briggs declared. "You have no authority here. We are the authority." The statement hung in the air, behind. The judge, Constance, stood rigid. Margaret clutched the railing, knuckles pale. Gabriel remained inside the doorway, silent. Briggs pointed toward him. "He has disrupted families. He has done nothing," Hawthorne replied sharply. "Exactly," Briggs shot back. "He stands there doing nothing, and still wives lose sense." A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was easier to blame one man than confront weakness within themselves. "You cannot hold him responsible for imagination," Hawthorne said. Briggs smiled thinly. "Imagination does not burn stables." The accusation landed, though no proof linked Gabriel to the earlier fire. The rumor had grown roots. "You have until the end of the month," Briggs announced. "Remove him, or we will." The crowd dispersed, slowly, satisfied for the moment. Inside, silence swallowed the house. Constance turned to her husband. "You see now," she whispered. Hawthorne's face hardened. "They bluff." Margaret shook her head. "They don't." That night, the Hawthornes argued for the first time in years. "You're risking everything," Constance said. "For what?" "Principle." "For law," he corrected. "Law," she snapped. "The town has already decided law doesn't matter." He had no answer. In his study, alone, Hawthorne stared at the original bill of sale, a document that once represented control, certainty. Now it felt like evidence of complicity. Upstairs, Margaret paced her room, Her broken engagement had become public humiliation. Her former friends no longer visited. Whispers followed her in church. All because of him, or so she told herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't Gabriel who shattered her world. It was the realization that her world had always been fragile. Days later, violence came not as a mob, but as a test. A single shot rang out at dusk. The bullet shattered a lantern near the servant quarters. No one was injured. But the message was clear. Fear had moved from threat to action. Judge Hawthorne finally made a decision. He called Gabriel into the study. "You understand the situation?" he began. "Yes, sir. They will not relent." "I know." Hawthorne hesitated. "I can arrange for you to be transferred, quietly. North of here, it may buy peace." Gabriel studied him. "Buy peace for whom?" "For my family." The honesty stung. "And for you," Hawthorne added. Gabriel shook his head slowly. "They will not find peace in my absence. They will find another symbol." Hawthorne's voice sharpened. "You presume much. I observe much." Silence. "Stretched. You owe me obedience," Hawthorne said at last. Gabriel met his gaze, not defiant, not submissive. "You purchased my body," he replied calmly, "not my conscience." The words struck harder than any accusation shouted outside the gates. Hawthorne dismissed him, unsettled. The following Sunday, events spiraled beyond calculation. As the Hawthornes prepared for dinner, shouting at the perimeter. This time, the crowd was larger. Torches flickered against the darkening sky. Briggs stood at the front again, but he was no longer merely spokesman. He was catalyst. "We warned you," someone shouted. A rock flew, then another. Windows shattered in violent succession. Constance screamed as glass rained onto the floor. Margaret pulled her toward the hallway. Hawthorne stepped forward, fury overtaking caution. "This is unlawful," he roared. A torch arced through the air. It struck the front curtains. Flames climbed instantly. Panic replaced pretense. The crowd had not come for negotiation. They had come for spectacle. Smoke thickened rapidly. Servants rushed to contain the fire, but chaos reigned. And through it all, Gabriel moved with clarity. He ushered Margaret toward the back exit. He lifted a fallen beam from the hallway to clear Constance's path. When a portion of ceiling collapsed near the staircase, he shielded Hawthorne from falling debris. Outside, neighbors watched, some horrified, some satisfied. The fire was contained before the entire house succumbed, but not before damage was done. The Hawthorne estate, once a symbol of stability, stood scarred. So did its occupants. No arrests followed. No investigations. The town framed it as passion. Inside the charred parlor, Judge Hawthorne finally understood. He had believed ownership equaled control. But control had been an illusion. Constance wept quietly as she surveyed the damage. Margaret stood apart, eyes fixed on Gabriel. "You saved. You, she said softly. He did not respond, because saving them did not change what they were to him, or what he was to them. That night, as smoke lingered in the air, the decision was no longer about law, pride, or money. It was about survival, and survival demands sacrifice. Outside the broken windows, Atlanta waited. Not for justice, for resolution. And resolution, in times like these, rarely favors the innocent. Winter came early that year. The fire left the Hawthorne estate standing, but altered. Blackened curtains were removed. Broken glass replaced. Charred wood scraped and painted over. From a distance, the house looked restored. Up close, the scars remained. Atlanta moved on the way towns always do. Markets reopened. Church bells rang. Public outrage cooled into private gossip. But nothing returned to what it had been. Judge Hawthorne stopped attending tavern gatherings. Invitations ceased altogether. Business partners withdrew quietly. His authority, once unquestioned, now felt ceremonial. Constance left the property rarely. When she did, conversations lowered as she passed. Margaret no longer pretended not to notice. The Hawthorns had not been exiled. They had been repositioned, just far enough outside the circle to serve as warning. And at the center of it all stood Gabriel. The calls for removal never disappeared. They simply softened into suggestion. Sell him, transfer him, send him west. Each proposal framed as practical, necessary, peacekeeping. Judge Hawthorne resisted for weeks, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps because surrender would mean admitting the town had been right to threaten him. But winter tightens more than weathered tightens options. One evening in late December, a letter arrived without signature. It contained no threat, only a single sentence. If he remains, the next fire will not be contained. Constance did not argue this time. Margaret did not protest. Even Hawthorne, staring at the words long after midnight, felt the truth settle in his bones. The town would not stop, and the town did not need proof it needed release. The decision was made quietly. No announcement, no public notice. Arrangements were handled through discreet contacts beyond Georgia state lines. Gabriel was to be transferred north, officially sold to a shipping intermediary, unofficially freed once across state borders. It was not justice, it was compromise. On the morning of his departure, frost coated the edges of the fields. The house was still. Margaret waited in the hallway as Gabriel stepped forward with a single, small bag, the only possession he carried. "You're leaving because of us," she said. "I'm leaving because they need me to," he answered calmly. "That isn't fair." He offered a faint smile. "Fairness was never part of this," she swallowed. "You could have fought back and proved them right," he asked gently. Silence settled between them. "You changed this town," she whispered. He looked toward the distant rooftops barely visible through morning mist. "No," he said softly. "I revealed it." Constance approached next. Her composure was intact, but her eyes betrayed something heavier. "You saved my family," she said. He inclined his head. "I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," she replied. There were 1,000 things she might have said. Apology, gratitude, confession. Instead, she stepped aside. Judge Hawthorne waited at the front door. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I upheld the law," Hawthorne said finally. "Yes, sir." "And the law failed." Gabriel held his gaze. "The law reflects the people who write it." The words lingered in the cold air. Hawthorne extended his hand, a gesture unthinkable months earlier. After a pause, Gabriel took it, not as servant, not as equal, but as two men, briefly acknowledging the illusion between them. The carriage arrived, without ceremony. No crowd gathered. No torches burned. Atlanta did not need spectacle this time. It needed distance. As the carriage rolled down the long drive, Margaret stood frozen at the gate. She watched until the wheels disappeared beyond the curve of the road. 4 weeks afterward, the town exhaled. Stability returned. No more rallies, no more broken windows. No More whispered panic. Families resumed their routines. Church sermons shifted focus. Men reclaimed certainty. And yet, something lingered, because removing a symbol not erased what it exposed. Elizabeth Crane eventually returned to public life, quieter than before. Rebecca Sutherland never fully recovered her composure. Carolyn Pembroke left Atlanta the following spring, citing personal reasons. Judge Hawthorne remained in his position, though diminished. Constance resumed her social duties, though invitations never quite reached their former warmth. Margaret declined new proposals of marriage. None of them spoke Gabriel's name again. But they remembered. They remembered how easily admiration turned to accusation. How quickly desire became blame. How fragile their structure had been beneath one man's quiet presence. Months later, a rumor drifted back through trade routes. A man matching Gabriel's description had been seen in Philadelphia. Working, raiding openly in public parks, walking without escort. Unremarkable. Free. No confirmation followed. The rumor was enough, because, in the end, he had not destroyed families, he had not seduced wives, he had not incited violence. He had simply existed in a space that demanded he be invisible. And when he refused to disappear, the illusion fractured. Atlanta survived. The whole survived. But they were changed, not by scandal, by revelation. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing a person can do is stand calmly inside a lie. And sometimes the most powerful rebellion is refusing to become what others fear. If this story made you think, if it made you question how Azali truth can be twisted and blame misplaced, make sure you subscribe for more powerful untold stories like this.